2020 Radical Educator Speaker Series. I'm Mari Gray, and I am an assistant professor of ed leadership here at CSU East Bay. And I know you have lots of options for your time on this beautiful day, and we're very happy to have you all here with us. We're happy that you chose to come here and hear from our guest speaker tonight, or today, so in the daytime. I want to introduce you to Dr. Eric Haas, Director of our EDD and Educational Leadership. Dr. Haas.
Thank you. So, yeah, let me echo what Dr. Gray said. Thank you for coming on this glorious day for what I know will be a fantastic talk and discussion with Dr. Ocampo. So I want to just give a brief history of how we got here today. Let's see if I know how to work this correctly. Yeah. So this is the second year of this speaker series. Last year we had 3 well-known speakers on a variety of topics. Some of you came to these and saw these last year, and we were fortunate enough to get funding to do this again this year. And this year, some of you came in November for Dr. Kucha Rissling-Baldi, and with her talk on indigenous feminism and really pushing us to be active and not just talk about these issues, but actually make a difference. And then we have Dr. Ocampo today, and I'll show you his slide. Let's see that I didn't go to full slideshow. So let's get it right there. Or not. Oh, there we go. All right, this is better. So we have Dr. Poor Khurshid coming on March 5th, and then at our Leadership Institute in May, we have Dr. Maisha Wynn, who is up at UC Davis, all national and to a certain degree international experts in their field. But today, we're thrilled to have Dr. Anthony Ocampo come and speak with you today. Sean, Julie is here. Thank you. Sure. So let me pause for a moment. So we're thrilled to have Dr. Anthony Ocampo here today. And Dr. Gray is going to introduce him in a second, but I just want to give you a quick anecdote about how powerful his subject matter is. I went to the hardware store this morning just to buy to replace a burnt out light bulb. And the cashier saw me dressed up and said, "Oh, you're dressed up for Saturday." I said, "Well, I'm going to host a presentation." And she said, "Well, what's it about?" And I paused for a second. I was like, "Do we really want to go into like academic speak?" And I was like, "Well, let's do it." I said, "Well, it's dealing with intersectionality of race and gender and education." And she stopped and said, "That is so important. I'm so glad you're doing that." And she's like, "I would come, except I have to work here today." She ended up filling out a whole sheet of paper with information that she pulled on her work in this area and how important it is for us to do that. So, feel lucky that you have this chance to come and experience it yourself. So, without further ado, let me hand this back to Dr. Gray, who will give a further introduction to Dr. Ocampo.
So, what Dr. Haas doesn't say in his history of this series is we had 1 year where we didn't have the series. We wrote a grant, we didn't get the grant. Then we had this year we got the grant because Dr. Haas wrote the grant. So I want to give him just a hand clap. Thank you. And I also want to thank my colleague Katie Strom, Dr. Katie Strom, for we have the speakers we have because of her research. We collaborated on finding who we thought would speak to our campus and our program. I want to just thank Dr. Strong for doing that. Debbie's in the room, yes she is. Everything after the things that we did was Debbie. So the space, the logistics, the food that you're going to eat after this, and the reception. Just thank Debbie. She does so much for our college, for our department, and we just need to recognize her. I'm so excited to be here to stand before you today because I get to introduce Dr. Ocampo. And it's a real treat. I'm going to read you his bio because I want to get it right. Dr. Anthony Ocampo is from our sister college, our sister campus, Cal Poly Pomona. And he is an associate professor of sociology and a Ford Foundation fellow. He's the author of The Latinos of Asia, How Filipino Americans Break the Rules of Race, and co-editor of Contemporary Asian America. His research on the educational trajectory of second-generation Latinos and Asian Americans has been published in journals of education, sociology, and ethnic studies, including Race, Ethnicity, and Education, Ethnic and Racial Studies, Latino Studies, and the Journal of Asian American Studies. Dr. Ocampo's research and commentaries on immigration, race, and education have been featured on NPR, Public Radio International, I know we all listen to that, the New York Times, we read that, and the San Francisco Chronicle. Thank you for all your work. He is currently working with NYU Press on his second book about the comparative educational experiences of Latino and Filipino American queer male youth in Los Angeles. And we're so lucky to hear about this. His talk is titled, I hope I have this still right, Rethinking Race, Gender, and Education, Intersectional Approaches to School-Community Relationships. Please welcome, with a big round of applause, Dr. Anthony Ocampo.
Hi, everybody. So we have, oh yeah, this is not my PowerPoint. First of all, I wanted to say thank you. It's been such a, I mean, we've only met via email, and so it's been really cool to meet in person. We talked over the phone. I accidentally called Mari at 1:45 in the morning because I butt dialed in my sleep. But I'm very, very excited to be here. Just to get a sense of the room, we have a lot of people in the certificate program, the doctoral program as well, EDD program. Cool. Well, it's always funny to hear some of these biographical descriptions of yourself because in so many ways it doesn't seem real. Like my experience is not unlike a lot of your student, like the students you work with right now, the students that you attend, like that you share space with here at the Cal State, where there was so many moments in which I felt like who I was as a person, who I was as a Filipino American, a son of immigrants, a queer person, had essentially zero to no value. And so it's taken me a lifetime to endure graduate training and just, academia to put all this work together. And I feel like the underlying message of what I want today to be about is there's a lot of important knowledge that emerges when you center the communities who don't often get voice within educational spaces. And today, I've done this in my work with Filipino Americans, and today I'm going to be focusing on specifically this book that Mari referenced that I'm working on about queer youth of color, particularly queer boys of color from immigrant families. Just one caveat, the research that I'm doing is focused, and the research talk today is going to focus primarily on queer second generation boys, young men. So these are folks whose parents were born in some other country, but they themselves were born in the United States. I just want to say that my focus, the fact that I'm focusing on cisgender men specifically, that by no means is me trying to signal that focusing on cisgender men is something that is like there's sorry, I'm just like making sure she's okay. Focusing on cisgender men, I know that I'm privileging their perspectives and voices today. And I want to be upfront and say that I have done extensive research also on queer women, as well as transgender children of immigrants. But what I was finding, tied to the idea that the personal is political, I felt that the data collection process was just qualitatively different. when I, as a researcher, as a cisgender male, was interviewing folks that were either queer women or trans folks of color. And so I felt like rather than do their stories injustice, I wanted to focus on a group where I felt comfortable, my social location matched up enough where I was telling this story as authentically as possible. So I just want to acknowledge that up front. So anyway, thank you for the introduction again. I'm working on this book with NYU Press. It's currently entitled Brown and Gay in LA, Queer Sons of Immigrants Coming of Age. And I'm really excited. This book is technically due by the summer. I have to finish it, and I'm about 70% done. But what I really love is that I'm going to be talking with folks today about some of the findings from the book. And you, as educational experts, folks that are experts in your communities and fields, I'm really excited that you're going to pose to me your questions, your critiques. And I'm really excited because the comments you're going to give, I know, are greatly going to improve the writing and the finishing of this book. So in advance, thank you for your comments. So what this book is about, it chronicles a story of about 60 some second generation queer, Latinx, Filipinx American young men in Los Angeles. And part of the reason I was focused on this group is because if you watch the news, you see that issues of race, issues of immigration, issues of gender, issues of LGBTQ rights, those are front page news items. But when you think about folks whose lives intersect across all four arenas, it's very rare that you hear folks' perspective on media, on television, et cetera, et cetera. And so what I wanted to do here is center the voices of those folks whose lives intersect across these four different ongoing social movements. So broadly speaking, this area of research fits with, when I was in graduate school, everyone has to pick an expertise, and the expertise I wanted to pick was about children of immigrants, the immigrant second generation, which again is folks whose at least one parent was born abroad, and they were born here in the United States. Part of the reason I was interested in this is because of my own biography. Another reason was because my PhD advisor was at the forefront of creating theoretical frameworks on the incorporation of children of immigrants. And in graduate school, I remember I was really inspired by this one piece entitled The New Second Generation, Segmented Assimilation and Its Variants. And this is, have you read this piece or no? Oh.
I think it looks really interesting. That's what I need that sound.
Yeah. So, in sociology, there was, before this article was published before 1993, the conventional knowledge within sociology was that immigrants, their children, and their grandchildren would somehow assimilate into some American middle-class mainstream. And to some extent, that made sense given that they were basing their theories on immigrants from Europe, who are, as you know, racially white, were legally white. But as we all know, after 1965, the literal face of immigration changed. So instead of coming from Europe, we had immigrants that were coming from Asia, Latin American societies, Mexico, the Caribbean. And so no matter what level of assimilation, no matter how well folks speak English, no matter how acclimated they get to American culture, the reality is that race means that there's no way immigrants are going to assimilate into some imaginary American middle-class mainstream. And so Min Jo, who's my advisor, along with her mentor, Alejandro Portes, came up with this idea that incorporation, I'm not going to use this word assimilation, but incorporation into American society happens, it's a segmented process, which means that whether we're talking about education, whether we're talking about occupation, whether we're talking about the neighborhood folks live in, immigrants and their children are going to be incorporated into different segments of society, which makes sense given how increasingly racially diverse the United States was becoming. So this was their big contribution to sociology. It was a big paradigm shift in immigration, and it has spawned, if you look, this is Google Scholar. If you go on Google Scholar and you type this article in, you'll see that it's inspired over 6,000 articles, books, policy reports that focus specifically on the immigrant second generation. folks, children of Latin American immigrants, children of Mexican immigrants, children of Asian American immigrants, children of African and Caribbean immigrants. There's a whole field within sociology just specifically on children of immigrants. So this is the area of expertise I was trying to develop in graduate school, circa 2004. How long did grad school take? 2004 to 2011. So all the while that I was in graduate school, I went to UCLA, which for those who may not know is like a hop, skip, and a jump from West Hollywood, California. And West Hollywood, for those that don't know, it's the equivalent to like the Castro district in Los Angeles. It's like the like a gay neighborhood, gay social center of Los Angeles. Part of the reason I spent a lot of time there, again, is I myself am queer. And I was, during this period of grad school from 2004 to 2011, was, coming into my own sexuality, queer identity. So, I mean, just to be real, when I was like at UCLA, I would go to school, do all what I need to do for grad school. But by 10 o'clock, I was like at the clubs in West Hollywood. In part because, like, again, I was in this like coming of age of my own queer identity. And as anyone that knows queer folks know, queer folks aren't allowed to have the same coming of age experiences that heterosexual folks are in junior high and high school. And so all these things like dating, first kisses, first breakups, all these things, they happen in the context of the club. So I say this because all of this research I was doing during the daytime about children of immigrants, at no point did I ever come across an article or a book that actually drew from the experiences of children of immigrants who also happen to identify as queer. And the reality of my life after 10 p.m. every night was that I was encountering a ton of people who fit the category of children of immigrants and who also happen to be queer. So in my mind, I was like, where are these folks' perspective in all the research that I'm doing? How can you get a PhD in sociology and become a canonized expert on children of immigrants and ignore all of these people whose lives I know is directly shaped not just by sexuality, but the intersection of sexuality, race, class, gender, etc. So, real talk, I wanted to do this as my dissertation, but as you know, in academia, sometimes studying marginalized communities is devalued and undervalued. And so I kind of just started to dip my feet in it. In graduate school, I did an ethnographic study of queer Latinx communities, but it wasn't until I graduated from UCLA that I really started this project on a group that I call, the gay immigrant second generation. And I want to start today's talk. We have till about 3, right? That's our time? Or 2?
Well, 2.
2? Okay, yeah. So I want to start by sharing a story of one really notable queer son of immigrants who I call Armando. Of course, in sociology, we change people's names to protect their identity. But I just want to share a little bit about Armando's story because I think it illustrates the ways in which sexuality comes into play in folks' lives. So Armando, he grew up in El Monte, California, which is in the San Gabriel Valley. He's the youngest of 4 sons. Parents are both immigrants from Mexico. Mother does not work outside the home. Father worked in construction. He had a very precarious work situation. They were working class. Both parents had less than a high school education. In El Monte, it is, even though there are middle class pockets, there are parts that are a little bit like they're riddled with gang presence. And so one of his brothers was in a gang. And there was also issues of domestic violence in Armando's household. So this is the household. And I'm going to talk about these different contexts because, when you think about the school lives of students of color, it's not just the school life that matters, it's all the other stuff as well. So this is what was going on at home. In the context of El Monte as a neighborhood, it's a neighborhood that's 73% Latinx, mostly Mexican, and about 20% Asian American. The median income of El Monte is much lower than the average of the surrounding LA area. And, in terms of the educational context of El Monte, for the most part, there's less than 7% of people in El Monte that have a college degree. and about 18% actually have less than a high school degree. And I share this because what I'm trying to convey is that just living in El Monte and being in that neighborhood, it's not a common situation where you're going to run into folks that have experience with higher education. When it came to El Monte High School, when Armando talked about it and other people that went to this high school that I interviewed, they described it as such. It's similar racial demographics, about 80% Latino, 20% Asian American. What was interesting about the racial demographics, though, is that even though Asian Americans were just 20%, they occupied the majority of the honors and AP tracks, while Latinx students were mainly in the regular or remedial tracks. And this, in the school context, this was an environment, and I know a lot of people have read research on this, where Latinx boys were typecast in negative, or at worst criminalized by school authorities and school officials, even if they didn't do anything that would hint that they were they should be punished in any way. So anyway, according to that professor that I talked about, Minjo and Alejandro Portez, if you were to take Armando's family, neighborhood, school, and identity variables and use theoretical frameworks to try to predict what's going to happen, these factors usually predict that people either have positive outcomes or negative outcomes. When it comes to education, positive outcomes might be the aspiring to go to college, high grades. Negative educational outcomes might be lower grades, not believing that you're going to pursue higher education. So given the theory in sociology, one might predict that Armando, given all of these factors, one might predict that his educational trajectory would be more toward the latter, the more negative outcome. But actually, when I got to know Armando over the course of this research, what I learned is that Armando not only pursued higher education, he ended up at Georgetown University, one of the most selective universities in the country. And when you really start to dig into Armando's story, what you really see is that all these variables still came into play, but there was this intervening factor that researchers just generally did not think of, and it was really clear, in part because we're both queer, that his sexual identity, his queerness, was a mitigating factor in his educational process. So, during Q&A, I could talk all about Armando and other people, but this is the sort of contradiction or paradox that I wanted to use to set up. Anyway, so it's moments like that that I love in research, where when you center the experience and the perspective of someone that's not just in the margins, but the margin of the margins, that these cool insights emerge. So that's the crux of this book. It's on the gay second generation. These are folks who, again, inspired by the work of Patricia Hill Collins, inspired by the work of Kimberly Crenshaw. I wanted to see what happens in the context of school when race, gender, and sexuality intersect together. So for today, for the latter half of the presentation, I'm going to focus on the comparative educational experiences of Latinx and Filipino American queer male youth, primarily in the K-12 context. And the reason I wanted to do this is because we often talk about what life is like for queer students, as if queer students is a monolith. But I think in doing the comparative case, you get to really see that, in fact, there's a lot of other variables that come into play. So ultimately, what I'm going to show you with some of the stories today is that, yes, sexuality affects school, but race also affects the strategies that are available for queer youth of color to survive and thrive in the context of schools. Part of the reason I was really interested in this is because I noticed something about education literature, which was that there's this explosion of research on LGBTQ students, right? We know that, and there, within education research primarily, and then within sociology, there's been this explosion of research, as I showed you, on educational outcomes about children of immigrants. What's interesting, though, is that this group that I'm talking about, the gay immigrant second generation, has been very much overlooked in education research, in sexuality research, and race research. Why is this the case? What explains this gap? I've been trying to rack my brain about what's going on. There's a handful of memoirs about queer folks of color, or E. Patrick Johnson is this wonderful scholar who studied black gay men in the South. But beyond that, there wasn't much that focused on the intersection of race, sexuality when it came to boys in school. And so what I was racking my brain and trying to think what's going on. So part of what I realized is that when you do a quick search of scholarship on LGBTQ students, for the most part, it overwhelmingly focuses on bullying and school climate, which makes sense because of this national spotlight that's been put on things like queer youth suicide, depression, mental health issues, things of the sort. That makes sense why most studies are framed around bullying and school climate. In contrast, when you look at the research on Latinx students and Asian American students, almost always the frame of the discussion is about race and the educational achievement gap, right? There's actually, one time my friend Daniel Sujinda, who's a professor at Cal State Stanislaus, we actually tried to do some digging about Asian American students and bullying, and we found that there wasn't a lot of research that was talking about bullying among Asian Americans, even though it came up in our research, in part because the Asian American scholarly narrative is so focused on what? Model minority stereotype, right? So the way in which researchers think about communities and the frames that they adopt, they end up creating a bit of they create blind spots in which certain groups are unable to emerge in the research. Obviously, the frames of discussion is not the only thing that was going on. When you look at the data and recruitment process for studies, the reality is in sexuality and gender research, there's not a lot of people of color there. And the reality is in race research, there are queer people there, but there are moments in which if a queer person wanted to pursue queer-focused research, something about that trajectory, they would get shut down. And so when it comes to the data and recruitment and research issues, what you have in sexuality research, and I'll just use the Gay, Lesbian, Straight Educational Network study as an example, the GLSEN study as an example. When they do these amazing research studies of school climate, it almost overwhelmingly focuses on white samples. They want a nationally representative sample, which is really admirable, but for the most part, the majority of the people in the sample are white and are predominantly white. And so the difficulty there is that when it comes down to talking about how life is like for students of color, if you download any of the 200-page policy reports that the GLSEN releases, there's like 3 pages that talk about race, which is very limited. It's an amazing school climate survey, but as a queer person of color, I can't help but think wow, 3 pages that talks about race. It's mind-boggling, right? Similarly, there are research studies that have significant portions of queer students of color, such as the California Healthy Kids Survey. But in that respect, the sample is predominantly folks that are cisgender women or female women-identified respondents. Why? Because young men, we're talking about, it's a different era today, but for the most part, young men are still significantly less likely to opt into a study about queerness than women are because of gendered expectations, et cetera, et cetera. Finally, when it comes to these seminal studies that focus on children of immigrants, these, if you open up any of the questionnaires or these data sets, there's literally not a single question that gets at sexual identity, sexuality, nothing. Not a single question. So where does that put us? Where does that put us with respect to research? Well, part of the solution, and what I love about education is that education researchers unapologetically allow for the centering of marginalized voices, right? Because they really feel like that's the seeds of new knowledge are from centering marginal voices in empirical research. So that's what I'm trying to do here. Again, inspired by Kimberly Crenshaw, Patricia Hill Collins, and researchers like Sean Harper. even though, like, what's interesting about, like, sociologically about studying schools is that schools are like an amazing place to study social inequality. I know that in popular thinking, we think of schools as like the great equalizer that erases inequality, but in fact, all of you know that schools are places where material resources, social support, those are differentially distributed based off race, based off gender, based off sexual identity, right? So schools are actually an amazing place to study the way social inequality works. And again, the cool thing about doing a comparative project is that you get to really see how the unwritten rules of race, gender, and sexuality emerge, right? In a lot of schools, I know we're in the Bay Area, so this is a wonderful place where students actually have ethnic studies. But in other parts of the country, students get schooled on race, but there's no actual class. It's actually just their outside the classroom experiences where they learn about racial inequality. So anyway, what's going to drive the findings is how do race and sexuality affect the educational experiences of Latinx and Filipinx American queer male youth? I am going to speed through data. Oh, really? Are you okay? Okay.
We were here until the other reception at 2 something.
Okay, okay. All right, cool. All right, cool. I think I can do it. So, data, I think I want to talk about this because, again, like trying to recruit queer folks of color for study is hard. I don't know if anyone's ever tried to do research on LGBTQ communities, but you know, people with PhDs tend to have a hard time doing it. And so I was really pleased that, you know, being part of this community allowed me access in a way where I was able to secure 60 some folks to sit down for anywhere from an hour to 3.5 hours just to talk about their lives, right? And a lot of times with queer folks, I can't tell you how many times during an interview where folks were like, I've never talked about this. I've never had a space where I can talk about this. Thank you. And so these interviews were so, oh my gosh, like, I can't tell you how many times we did the interview at a Starbucks and I had to go to the bathroom just to like cry because it was just so incredibly emotional. And it gives me goosebumps just remembering those stories. And I'm really sad that I can't share like all of them, but I'm gonna try to share some that I think are really pertinent and powerful for the work that you do. So my recruitment strategy, given that it is challenging to recruit queer folks of color, I relied on methods that have been used by queer researchers of color. So I went to ethnic specific and mainstream LGBTQ social functions in LA. I went to gay pride events. Colleges were really great places to recruit respondents. And then of course, I didn't want to just get folks that were inclined to participate in public queer spaces, and so I also did a little bit of snowball sampling to capture folks who may not be as embedded in queer POC communities. I know we're living in a very different time in terms of queer identity, but the men I interviewed are around the ages of 18 to 33 when I interviewed them, which means that at the time of the interview they were born between 1979 to 1992. So they're millennials, a little older than millennials for the most part. I think doing a study on Gen Zs, which is way more possible now, and later generations, I think it'll yield super different results. But still, I just wanted to say, like, out of the people I interviewed, only 10 were out in high school in any capacity. I'm talking like they told one friend. And out of that, only 2 said that they were out to a teacher. Out of the 63, 2 people said that a teacher was aware that they were queer. And just one teacher, not all the teachers. So it's really heartbreaking with this because in one of these 2 cases, there was a teacher who knew about this respondent's queerness and then left to get married. They got married and then moved to a different city, and you just saw the experience of this one, like that one teacher ally was everything, and you just saw that person's trajectory just sink. So anyway, 75% felt like, you know, sometimes people are like, oh, what's more important, race or sexuality? 3/4 of people were like, I can't do that. So they're both important to me. And 60% said they experienced some sort of like discrimination or prejudice because of both their race and sexuality, which sort of suggests that frameworks that only look at race, frameworks that only look at gender, frameworks that only look at sexuality are incomplete, particularly in how they're able to explain what's going on in these boys' lives. So anyway, so the fun part is always the research findings. And again, I'm going to talk about primarily 3 respondents that I interviewed that I think really showcase like the ways in which the survival strategies of queer boys is affected by race. But again, during Q&A, I'm happy to talk about all 60-some respondent stories at any point. So, research findings. The reality is, like, there is this narrative that it's getting better, right? That's a very popular Dan Savage promoted narrative, right? And to some extent, there's research that shows that over the past 15 or so years, things are getting better. So people are less, like students in schools are less likely to say things like that's so gay or use homophobic remarks. It's not totally dissipated, but it's on the decline. Harassment of LGBTQ students is declining at a somewhat steady rate. I wish it was faster, but it's still declining, particularly verbal harassment is declining. And then the availability of resources, whether it's queer ally teachers or GSAs, gay straight alliances, those are on the upswing over the past 15 years. So all of this data suggests things are getting better, and to some extent they are. But if there's anything we know about social movements, we know that not all members of social movements are affected by progress equally. All you got to do is think about like the Black Civil Rights Movement and think about what happened with women and queer Black folks in the Civil Rights Movement. All you got to do is look at mainstream feminism and look at what happens at women of color and trans women of color in that larger movement. All you got to do is look at the larger LGBTQ movement and see that it's very much dominated by gay white men of a particular class background, right? So given all that stuff, what I was hearing from folks is that even though things are getting better, it wasn't getting better for them, or it didn't really get better for them. Even if there was a GSA at their school, they wouldn't go, because just even being seen adjacent to a GSA or being seen in proximity to a queer teacher or queer ally teacher, that might get you outed. When it came to race, that also came in the racial climate of a school. Latinx respondents that I interviewed said, you know, in my school, Latino students tend to get stereotyped. It doesn't really create the best rapport for students. Even though Filipino students talked about getting positively stereotyped as like the good students, that also had an effect because it left the impression that, oh, as one of the good students, I'm not supposed to have problems. Or if I have problems, I'm supposed to figure it out on my own. That came up a lot with my Filipino respondents. Coming out, the act of coming out, that participating in GSA, that was often framed as like a white thing by respondents. They would say things, well, of course, like queer kids could come out because they don't live with the same pressures as I do. As this, like, I have immigrant parents, I got family in the Philippines or in Mexico that I gotta think about. They would frame it as a white thing. That also happened. And of course, it was still the case that there were teachers that were either outright homophobic or more commonly complicit when it came to hearing homophobic or transphobic comments. They wouldn't do anything to punish students that engage in some such hurtful remarks. So what's left? What are the survival strategies available to queer male youth of color if this is the context in which they're living? Well, then what ended up happening with a lot of respondents was that they engaged in what sociologist Irving Goffman calls covering. So this is the textbook definition. It is a fact that persons who are ready to admit possession of a stigma, in many cases because it is known about or immediately apparent, may nonetheless make a great effort to keep the stigma from looming large. This process will be referred to as covering. So covering wasn't about trying to front that you were heterosexual, because a lot of these respondents sort of already started to question or had in the back of their mind that they're different from other men and other young boys in their school. But covering was about trying to front load some other aspect of one's identity so that it put to rest rumors or gossip about their perceived or suspected queer sexuality. So this included things like joining student council. There was a lot of people that ran for student council. Joining sports, even joining the band. But one of the most common forms of academic covering that emerged out of my data is something I call academic covering. So academic covering was this idea of using school kind of like as a cover, or literally, yeah, duh. Using school as like an avatar, right? You sort of front load your schoolboy identity, and even though that could get you made fun of, it's still better than being seen as gay. And so academic covering was this idea of investing in the educational game. So this idea of becoming ingratiated into a particular pathway where you're like the good student. That's okay. You can deal with that identity more so than being the gay student. Again, because folks' school lives is not the only thing that matters to them, it was really interesting to see how they talked about academic covering in the context of school, but also how it was an effective strategy with family. So let me give you an example. So one of my respondents, Armando actually, he said, I have to be in the AP and honors classes because in those classes, it's not my masculinity that gets tested all the time. All that matters is how smart I am. Whereas if I'm in PE, if I'm in my regular classes, if I'm in regular art class, then I'm subject to the same sort of harassment and bullying that I was subjected to in my household for being gay, for example. When it came to academic covering in the context of like the neighborhood and like their ethnic communities, church communities, and their family lives, it was a great cover because if they were ever pressed about, why don't you have a girlfriend yet? Saying I'm focusing on school was the best way to shut down that conversation. So many of the respondents said, if I can't be the football son, I'll at least be the smart son. So they used their school as a way to win back points they knew they would lose for being gay. So what's interesting though, and this is where I'm going to get into the three individuals, is that when you compare respondents' relationship to the strategy of academic covering, when you compare Filipinos and Latinx respondents, you see a very different pathway to this strategy. And I think that the difference in pathway really highlights the ways in which race intersects with sexuality to affect the everyday lives of queer boys of color. So let's do that. So I'm going to start with talking about the overall pattern among Filipino queer male youth. So I know that you've probably read about, like anything you read in education classes about Asian American students, and I saw someone mouth it earlier, the model minority stereotype is a thing, right? And it was the case that Filipino American respondents talked about they themselves or Filipinos in their school being typecast as the good students, right? Filipinos went to very racially diverse high schools, and in their high schools, vis-a-vis the other students of color, they were pegged as like the good students. That was a very common narrative among respondents. And so because of this, academic covering, of course, the respondents never said the words academic covering. Academic covering was a strategy that was very common among Filipino respondents. It was sort of like an obvious go-to strategy. Part of the reason is because of that stereotype I mentioned, but it's interesting because, they could say, Filipinos could say that we were the good students in our school, but what's really more revealing is when you ask them to describe the racial context of their schools. Whether these Filipinos went to school in Los Angeles, middle class, working class, neighborhood schools, whether they were folks that went to school in San Diego. I interviewed some folks that went to school in Central Valley, the Bay Area, even a few that went to school in New Jersey, right? Because my recruitment was folks that were living in LA, so they could have gone to high school anywhere. Across the board, Filipinos described their high schools in similar ways. Filipinos and Asians were in the AP and honors classes. Latinx, African American students were in the remedial classes. Maybe there'd be one or two black and brown students in the AP and honors, but that was always framed as anomalous, whereas Filipinos being in those classes was the norm. It was amazing. No matter where they went to school, class background of the school didn't matter, but the racial structure stayed consistent. And so what that means is that Filipinos experience what sociologists call stereotype promise. This is like the inverse of Claude Steele's concept of stereotype threat. Stereotype promise is the idea that Filipinos, whether they're excellent academic performers or not, are going to be assumed to be hardworking, assumed to be smart, and assumed to be college bound, regardless of what they're actually doing in the context of school. So, Franklin Flores, by the way, all three gentlemen that I'm going to talk about, they all come from working class backgrounds. So, I wanted to control for class. Franklin Flores grew up in Riverside. He had parents that were college educated, but due to his father's chronic gambling issues, the fact that his father had a secret family in the Philippines that he was sending money to, I know, trifling, scandalous. And his mother had a physical disability, which made it difficult to secure employment. Lived in tough times economically. And so during junior high, pretty much got evicted over and over from apartments, lived in a local motel by the UC Riverside campus. Is a student that most teachers, if you just heard those things, you typecast at risk. What was fascinating, though, is that in Riverside, in the high school we went to in Riverside, where Filipinos were, there were Filipino students in small number, but primarily it was Black and Latinx students. It didn't matter that his actual domestic situation was really difficult. It didn't matter that his grades were subpar in junior high. Teachers assumed that he was from the good side of Riverside, and that he was a smart student and he was an honor roll student that deserves to go to college, right? It was interesting to him because even the Latinx classmates he grew up his whole life and went to school with his whole life that came from like really nice parts of Riverside, they would get typecast as like troublemakers, right? So it was really evident that race came into play with his high school experience. So he said, I was Asian, so they saw me as model minority. They not only assumed I was smart, they also assumed I was rich and from a good family. And so what's nuts about him is that he wasn't talking about this just randomly. He was talking about it how it was a precondition for the way he was able to cope with his sexual identity. Because what that meant was that when he was coming to terms with his queerness, he felt comfortable to talk to teachers. If he was afraid to be in the cafeteria, teachers would let him eat in the classroom by himself so he could feel safe, right? And they created a little bit of a social support, an incubator for him to he couldn't directly talk about his queer identity with them, but he at least was incubated from physical harm in the context of school. Anyway, he was someone that was like, I need to do well in school eventually. School is going to be my way out to be able to be free. Contrast that with Jaime Avila. He's working class background from a mixed status family. Grew up in a certain part of Orange County known as Santa Ana, which is the one part of Orange County that's predominantly Latinx. But he went to a school where he and his brothers were the only Latinos in the entire K through 6 context. All of his teachers were white. So I want to talk about Jaime a little bit. I want to fast forward to the time in which we met in person. When I met Jaime, he was kind of one of these people that I assumed would engage in academic covering, because when I met him, we were in West Hollywood. I met him at a club, and just imagine being in a club in West Hollywood on a weekend evening. And when we met, it came up that I was a college professor, and like right next to the dance floor, when he heard that I was a college professor, all he wanted to talk about was, how do you go get your PhD? Like he had just graduated with an English degree from Cal State LA. He did McNair. He wanted to go get a PhD. He started asking me, what are my favorite books? He started talking about my opinions on racial politics in the context of like a hip hop club, right? So this was someone that was very obviously like nerdy and like bookish, and he's total intellectual. And what was interesting though is that when you actually asked him about what his life like was, when I actually got to interview him, sit down with him and ask him about his trajectory, his early school experiences, he said he always loved books, he always loved reading, he always loved being a student. But from kindergarten through 6th grade, he was actually known as a troublemaker. And so he told me a story that really hits home with this. He said, again, he was one of the only brown kids in his predominantly white school in Orange County. He said that at some point he started to get bullied. He wasn't sure if it was because he was a little bit effeminate or it was because of his race. He said I couldn't tell which one it was. All I know is I was being bullied by multiple kids. And so I asked him, like, did you go to your teachers? And he said, no, I didn't go to them. He came up, like, instead he was like, I didn't go to my teachers because I felt I wasn't comfortable going up to them. And I asked him, well, what did you do? How did you cope with all the bullying that you were facing? And the strategy he shared with me was just phenomenally creative. This is what he said. He said, I was one of the few kids who would get free meal tickets for lunch. There would be Pizza Friday and they'd have Pizza Hut. And so I would give all of my tickets to the affluent kids so everyone would get free lunch. So when I heard this story, I was like, oh my God, this kid's not eating. Like, he's foregoing eating so that he could curry favor with the kids that are being mean to him. Number 2, it's just straight up really generous. Number 3, it's incredibly creative, right? The idea that he like delayed satisfaction so that he could win favor from the kids that are being mean to him, right? It's really telling that he felt the need to find the solution all by himself. So in my head, I was like, I wonder how the teachers reacted. Were they like, oh, Jaime, that's really generous of you? This is what he said. He said, I remember I got in a lot of trouble for that, just for giving out free pizza tickets. One of my teachers, Miss Miller, she would always scream my name, Avila, get your ass over here. Those exact words. I'll always remember those exact words. To tell you the truth, I didn't even know what the word ass meant. She always picked on me. In retrospect, I felt it might have had something to do with me being Mexican. So what's interesting about Jaime is that this wasn't the only time he tried to sort of win favor from his classmates or teachers. He said he would raise his hand in class, because again, he liked reading. And he would say teachers wouldn't call on him. If he said an answer, it would go without recognition. And then some white classmate would say the same thing and they get praised for the same comment. So he just sort of was like over it at some point. And he found a different way to cover, he said, he was like, I'm just going to become the class clown, which obviously doesn't help your reputation among teachers. So I don't want to just sort of blanket say that like Filipinos were able to academically cover and Latinos were not. Latinx respondents were able to cover, but what was really clear was that there had to be a certain set of conditions, a constellation of factors for them to be able to cover. They had to have attended a predominantly Latinx school. When I say predominantly, I'm not talking 50-60%. I'm talking like 85-90% Latinx school. Why? Because by default, there had to be at least some spaces in the AP and honors classes for Latinx students. Right? There, it was more likely that they encountered often a teacher of color, who would play what sociologist Glenda Flores describes as a cultural guardian. So these are teachers that are invested in the academic cultivation of students, but have enough racial consciousness that they're able to help young people usurp moments, very racialized or racist moments that would undermine or hinder their academic trajectories. This would also be situations where they could intervene in students' lives where like race-related or class-related challenges would emerge, right? These were some teachers that would like pay for extracurriculars out of their own pocket, pay for college applications, stuff that they didn't, like going above and beyond the call of duty. Talking to parents in Spanish, right? The other issue here is that these were Latino students. They always talked about being framed in their schools as like the different, I'm the smart Mexican or the exceptional Mexican or the like unique one, which implicitly meant they was engaging in some sort of social distancing from the average Latino student. And this is what Armando's story was. So back to our original person. Armando, just to give you some background on him, he grew up in a tough household. His older brothers were the epitome of, masculinity is the way he described them. They were involved in sports, or they weren't involved in sports. There's a different type of like neighborhood masculinity, participation in a gang. That was not sort of his steez. One of his brothers in particular got very physical with him, physically harassed him, bullied him. And so what he started to realize is that, what he started to realize is that school was out of my way out of that madhouse. His mom, again, there was domestic violence going on in the household. Mom would be more than happy to drive him to the library. She'd sit in the parking lot for up to 4 hours, and he'd just sit in the library doing homework. School literally became, for him, his way out of that madhouse, a matter of daily survival. When he went to school, he had a moment in which he was typecast as negatively, but one of these teachers intervened in his case. It was a Latina teacher by the name of Mrs. Trujillo. She said, he got placed in the regular classes because he was shy, he was reserved, so they assumed that he was an English language learner and needed to be in a different set of classes. But one of his teachers saw that I was bored and that I was figuring out shit on my own. She was like, "You are really smart and talented, and one day you'll go to USC. You need to be in the honors track. And you need to go to the counselor and tell him that you want to be signed up in honors anyway." So here you see how a teacher is showing him how to navigate a really racially charged situation of being automatically placed in a particular academic track. And so while that gave him the ability to escape his household situation, he was able to be in summer programs that took him out of that very violent situation at home. He said that it was my way of coping with, same thing. It was my way of coping with sexuality, because if I can't be like the masculine son, I could at least be the smart boy, the smart son. But he said that it came at a cost. He said, "I tended to identify more with the Asian kids and the Latino kids, especially as I went further in high school, because I was in the honors track. No one really talks shit, but people always describe me as the kid who was hanging out with all the Asians. I felt like something was wrong with me because I had no Latino friends. I felt like I was Asian washed." So you see how constrained the choices of queer boys of color face. And I think his narrative highlights, oftentimes we celebrate these queer youth that are able to be resilient and persevere against the odds. But the reality is their individual success is in no way institutionally transformative. Nothing changed about their schools. Their teachers did not get more woke about LGBTQ issues. It just reinforced this idea that if he can do it, then all the kids that are marginalized should somehow magically be able to do it. So it's not institutionally transformative. Secondly, here's the thing about academic covering. It was predicated on one's ability to capitalize on racial stereotypes. Franklin was like, "I'm gonna be the smart Asian kid and ride that." And Armando was I'm gonna be the different Latino, which is inherently problematic. And finally, and this is what killed me when I followed them after their lives in high school, it reinforced the notion that their acceptance was at best conditional. And if they weren't overachievers or overperformers or significant money makers, their value as people didn't exist. So anyway, how does this relate to research? Well, I think it's really interesting because like the social organization of schools, everything, policies, the interactions, it creates identity meanings. The categories we hold on to really dearly, racial categories, sexual identity categories, gender categories, the value and meaning of those things are very much shaped by the everyday interactions in schools, as well as the policies in schools, the power dynamics in schools, which in turn affect educational choices of students or the way in which they navigate school. In other parts of the book, I talk about how the meanings and values of their identities, race, sexuality, can change dramatically. In high school, being a person of color, being a sexual minority, those may be those negatively affect people's lives. But once they got to a different institutional context like college, all of a sudden, those things could become assets that catapult their, social, community formation, academic trajectories, etc. It's just the institution context shifts. And finally, what I wanted to show is that when we think about the issue of gender, we have to think about it in really complicated ways. We often talk about gender in education, and it's always like, how do young men compare to young women? But as queer boys can show, there can be a whole lot of variety that's based on gender presentation. Gender transgression very much shapes how folks will navigate the educational spaces as well. So with that, I want to pause there and just open it up to some Q&A, because I would love to get your reactions and thoughts to this. I've had a lot of convos with friends in education about how this might be applicable to ed researchers as well as, ed practitioners. But again, I think it'd be more fruitful to talk to you and hear your thoughts given the work that you're doing. So thank you very much for having me.
Thank you so much. So hi everyone, I'm Katie Strom. I'm going to facilitate the Q&A and keep us on track to be able to head to the reception around 2:30. So would anybody like to offer up a question? Yes.
I have a question. You had mentioned that, I think, I hope I say it right, that sexuality was a mitigating thing in the trajectory?
Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit more
Yeah.
about that?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I'm going to use Armando, this last gentleman. By the way, that wasn't him. That was a stock photo from the internet. So Armando has a really great narrative about how sexuality mitigated his experience. So in El Monte High School, he was one of the few Latino boys, few men of color at all, in his AP and honors classes. In those AP and honors classes, it was the norm for students to create study groups. You study for AP whatever, you study for the SATs. Where does studying happen? It doesn't happen at school, it happens in people's homes. The majority of his classmates were Asian American women, young women. Obviously, he was friends with them, but in order to participate in study groups with them, he had to usurp the stereotypes that their immigrant parents had of a young Mexican American boy. So whenever they get invited, when his Asian American classmates would invite him to the house, they had to have a behind the scenes talk where it was because one was I'll just be straight up. One Asian American friend said, "My dad's afraid you're Mexican, so I'm going to get pregnant." That was just straight up what he was told. And so I told my dad, "Dad, don't worry, I'm not going to get pregnant." Wink, wink. Hinting that as a gay man, that wasn't something to be fearful of. So that was one example where sexuality very clearly mitigated the negative effects of race. So, yeah.
You talked about how you examined lots of different populations in this, but that you focused on the boys. Because you felt like you had a different kind of experience when you were interviewing them.
Yeah.
And it sounds like that was a positive thing to be an insider in this work. Can you tell me about some challenges that may have come up by being an insider in the work? And do you consider yourself an insider?
Yeah, that's a really wonderful question. So the insiderness, it came into play because it's funny. The first 5 minutes of some of my interviews are the respondents talking about, oh, were you at circus on Friday? Did you go to circus on Friday? Oh, are you gonna go to, like, it was about like queer nightlife, right? And I had to know what they were talking about in order for the interview to go well, because it showed that I had the same cultural knowledge, and so we can hit the ground running. The disadvantages, and I've noticed this with when I've interviewed sort of folks that I didn't meet in that way, is that there are, especially because of smartphones, there are a lot of queer second generation youth who either don't feel the need to make their way to these public spaces, or, you know, they don't have to. And the entree into queer communities is so different because there's geolocation apps, there's things like Instagram and stuff like that. And to be honest, like, my age made it so that was a little bit of a learning curve for me. When folks were like, we met on Tumblr, or we met on I was like, oh my God, I feel like my dad. Like, I had to learn things that were totally illegible to me, like Snapchat, and it was not sort of, I wasn't organically using it. And I think that can provide a learning curve that can delay the research process for sure. And then there's some folks where if you come off as someone that's an insider, it actually is a turnoff. So I had some respondents that were like, oh, you're part of the scene, so like, I was never part of the scene, so I can't relate to you. So in that sense, you know, I understand that my being an insider in that community could also actually hurt my ability to gain access to folks that have been marginalized by queer spaces because of body, ability. You know, like, those are things that are real things. So that's a great question. Thank you.
So you shared 3 of the participant profiles and shared that you had 63.
Yeah.
It is really terrific that you were able to get that. I have 2 kind of questions, and maybe just one. I know about time, however you want to do that. When the participants, if they did come out to families, was the fact that those that used academic covering and had achieved at an academic level, you talked about how it mitigated them within the school context. Did it also have that impact in coming out to their families? And did you find that there was consistency across participants to use academic covering as a strategy? Or for those that did not, did they have a very different outcome?
Yeah, you know, there was an interesting pattern among respondents who use academic covering. There were folks that described themselves as more gender transgressive / effeminate, right? So folks who passed as heterosexual sometimes didn't feel as compelled to engage in academic covering. That was one pattern that emerged. And then with families, it was mixed, to be honest. There were some families where they were like, I'm so proud to show my mom that I'm not the typical circuit boy, you know, drug using, insert disease, gay guy. They threw certain queer men under the bus and said, I'm the the respectability politics. And in some ways, in some families, that was like, it reinforced the idea that there's a good gay and a bad gay. In Armando's story, it was, he went to Georgetown, did the whole thing. Senior year of college, he told his mom that he was gay. And his mom was like, I don't have a son. After having racked up all that stuff, which led to all sorts of like 2 years worth of like, wow, everything I've been choreographing was all for nothing. That was he took a big hit, and then, got into some not so great stuff after. So, but I have to look more deeply about what the mechanism. Thank you for that question. So.
You spoke about how school became a safe space for many, for youth. And you also talked about GSA, which I know is not really being that safe space.
Mm-hmm.
It's more like an outing. Did any of them, of your respondents, mention like what type of space they were looking for or wanting in schools to provide that space of connection and fellowship?
Yeah, that like, what would be like, if you could go back in time and say what would a good one? I didn't ask that question. That's a really good question about to just ask, paint me what would be an ideal like an organization that you consider supportive. In the course of giving these talks, I came across a GSA by the name, it's on Instagram, Mendez GSA, which is one of the few GSAs somewhere in LA that is intersectionality is at the heart of everything they do. Everything they post, all the events that they do, it is an explicit topic of convo. I would imagine that a place where like there's no choosing, one feels no need to choose between ethnicity and race and sexuality would be an ideal spot. Because a lot of what folks were saying was like, if I do the GSA, it's almost like turning a back on my ethnic and racial identity, which in LA they grew up thinking that's really important, which it is. So it feels like a mutually exclusive choice. But that's a wonderful question. I think for the ones that did feel so, it's hard because for most it was just so bad. And so I think as I'm reflecting on the interview, yeah, that's the thing about sociology. People were like, oh man, like you never talk about hope or joy, like, but that's one thing. Someone asked me once, what could you change about the data collection process? I think I would have asked a question like yours, which gets at hope and joy and things, because those are all part of the part of their humanity too, that because sociology is so concerned with like the bad stuff, I didn't really get to. So maybe in the conclusion and intro. Yeah.
Yes. Hi, sorry, Tracy Noriega, alumni. I oversee professional development in my district for staff, administrators, classified folks. Out of your research, what do you think the overall themes are for implications in staff professional development?
Yeah.
Everyone has an entry point, but if I can plan something for my staff, what do you think those major themes would be?
Yeah. I love that question because it's like, what I would ask, and I got this, I'm borrowing this from Melissa Harris Perry, and I'm borrowing this from another woman, Tressie McMillan Cotton, writes about, they both write about Black women, and they have been wonderful in the sense that they have demonstrated, they've been really vocal about arguing that if you want to understand inequality, look at whose voices are totally absent and ask them what's going on. So as Black women, they're very privy to the fact of what it's like to be marginalized on multiple axes, not to mention things like body or, biraciality, whatever. And so what I would say is think about the student whose perspective is totally missing or absent, the one who never talks, Because a lot of these folks are like there were some folks who were like, I didn't say one word in high school, but they had a lot to say in this interview, which meant that they had a lot of things to say. And see what the world looks like from their point of view. It's been a really good rule of thumb. I really feel a sense of indebtedness to scholarship from the tradition of Black feminism that has really highlighted how centering perspectives that often don't get centered has the power to yield incredible insights about the way the world is not working in the right way. So yeah.
I'm AP3 faculty in speech language and science.
Cool.
So I really appreciated the comparisons that you made between these different cultural and racial groups. And I was wondering, first of all, whether queerness is viewed similarly in the two groups that you compared. And whether that, whether the individual's queer identities affected their ethnic identities in either, a stronger ethnic identity or less strong ethnic identity. And then how that factors into what you presented today in terms of their educational choices.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I always like thinking of, every time I get a question, I think of the one, like there's a respondent so there's a gentleman that talked about, I'm going to shift context to the college context, where he attended a school where there was a very vibrant Filipino American community, UCLA. And so, but when it came to issues of queerness, there was a certain adherence to a particular type of Filipino American masculinity within those spaces that made him being queer, gender transgressing, in different points in his life, gender non-binary, it made being Filipino very hard. And so he said straight up, being gay affects my life way more than being Filipino. And so it was in part because he grew up in a very Filipino neighborhood and now went to school with a ton of Filipinos. So, he never felt outsider until queerness came into play. So, could you repeat the other part of your question again? So just make sure
My first part was just whether queerness is viewed similarly in the two groups.
Yeah. I picked the two groups in part, it's like in my research, like I've always people assume Asian and Latinx are like two separate categories, but as a Filipino, I'm always like, it's an example of how we overly separate racial categories sometimes. So I picked Latinx and Filipino respondents because I felt like I could control on a lot of factors, like the Catholic thing, the ways in which like the family organization stuff, but the class dynamics are different. I do think that there are similarities, like in Philippine media and in Latino media, there is a tolerance of gay/queer people, but in a very limited way. Like, I'm reading this wonderful memoir by a trans Filipina immigrant called Ferris, and she's like, you can be bakla, you can be gay in the Philippines, but no one's gonna fall in love with you. And I think that's a similar thing about like the presence of queerness is there, but the idea of having a holistic humanity isn't. So I think it's also different though. Mexico was very progressive on gay rights in some respects, more than Philippines, but I think there's overlaps between the two, definitely. I don't, Eric, do you have a question? Yeah,
I did, but I didn't want to interrupt with other people. I wanted to I wanted to kind of commend you for just an amazing level of research that I think hopefully we're going to build on with our students, because I see so much of what they want to do in the types of research that we do. So I first want to thank you for that. Appreciate that. Secondly, I wanted to ask a very practical question, and that is, can you talk a little bit more about how you selected your sample of participants?
Yeah. So first off, thank you about the first thing, because like I said, like I'm still a Filipino kid that went to K-12 schools where Filipino-ness, let alone queerness, had no value, right? And so it's still scary to me to hold space for queer folks of color. I still feel, especially in this moment, it's not, I get really scared still, even though I have done what the discipline has prescribed me to do. That trauma never leaves. So thank you for that validation. Secondly, with respect to recruitment, in sociology, there's always, of course, you can get a random sample. In this case, it's impossible to get a random sample, and so I wanted to use what we like a purposive sample, which meant I wanted to get folks of different class backgrounds, folks of different self-described gender presentations. I wanted to get folks from sort of LA city center versus suburban LA. LA's big. And so it's just, it's very different if you grew up in the suburbs versus like near downtown. Access to, like, folks with differential access to public gay spaces. With respect to Filipinos, or even like skin color came into play as well. I didn't sort of count it, but I knew, like, given the way the gay community works, if you're a certain skin tone, you might find more greater access to mainstream gay spaces than darker skinned folks. So I thought about that as well. So, yeah, in the future, if I don't know, grant money, it's always the thing. It's like, you do what you can given your day job and stuff, but I really, when I started to do interviews of undocu-queer, undocu-trans individuals, and I saw how different things were, it makes me feel like on the one hand, I'm really grateful for the positive feedback, but on the other hand, I'm always like, and I don't know if queer people experience this, like the pressure to feel the need to do everything. Like you're like one of the few people that gets invited to talk about queerness, and you're like, shoot, like I don't want to impose the same harm by excluding as others. So, but I would love to do a humongous national survey on queer and trans people of color. That'd be the dream, and see how, because it's much more complicated. And I think specifically of one transgender Filipino American man who I interviewed, who was undocumented, and that's a book all its own, that person's story. And the other thing I'll say is, what's funny about all of these interviews, at the end of them, so many people ended with, I don't really feel like my story is that interesting or that special. And I'm really shocked at how many of my respondents, including this undocumented transgender Filipino American man, said, I don't really know it's that interesting. Like, my story is not that interesting. When in fact, I think that statement it's a byproduct of what institutions have conditioned us to feel about the importance of our stories. So again, thanks for that first part too. So.
Okay, so I'm going to invite everyone to come to the reception, and if you have questions, maybe you could have even a one-on-one.
Yeah.
So the food's going to be just out here and around the corner to the right.
Thank you so much, everybody.